Cost analysis, I'll just tell you, is sort of it was maybe 5 years ago, not even in the RFAs, right? This has definitely been an increasingly important topic, I would say, in the last 5 years. And every year it seems to be a little bit more is needed for cost analysis. At one point it's recommended, and then it's now required for different project types. So it's definitely an area that all of us are learning about. And we're trying to figure out the best way to incorporate this kind of information into proposals. So it's an interesting topic, and it's an interesting time, I think, to be learning about cost analysis, because even those of us who have been submitting for a long time are also learning about it as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our two guests. Actually, if you want to just advance that slide, I'm no longer controlling the slides. So we have our two, actually, I'll introduce the guests. We have Graham Rifenbark from the University of Connecticut and Tyler Hicks from the University of Kansas joining us to talk about cost analysis. And Graham, I'll let you introduce yourself and talk about your icon, and then Tyler can do the same.
Sure. So my name is Graham Rifenbark. I'm an assistant research professor here at the University of Connecticut. And so my background is I have a PhD in educational psychology and a concentration in research methods, measurement, and evaluation. And my tidbit is this scuba diver. It's probably one of my favorite things to do. I haven't done it in a very long time, but hope to be underwater soon. In a good way.
Hi, everyone. My name's Tyler Hicks, and I have a background in both special education and research and measurement. My logo is Bayes' theorem, because I'm an aspiring Bayesian statistician, and sometimes Bayesian statisticians are described as magicians and accountants combined in one, but actually Bayesian statisticians have nothing in common with accountants. But it is very magical and fixes about everything. People all the time say, oh, you can't estimate that model with that sample size. So I'm like, watch me. It can almost best estimate any model with any sample size. So that's why I like Bayesian statistics, since in special education, we often have small sample sizes. So that's my intro.
Thank you both. I'm going to turn it over to Graham.
Yeah, so it's sort of like an outline within an outline. We'll first give you sort of an overview. We'll give some examples of economic evaluation. We'll leave you some writing tips for these proposals. And then finally, we'll give you some resources for you to check out after the fact. So jumping off first with the overview. As Allison was saying, cost analysis and cost effectiveness, these are things that are becoming more and more important for IES proposals, and clearly they're sort of here to stay. The director of IES, I'm blanking on his name at the moment, but they've been working on creating standards for excellence in education research. They call it SIR. And so currently it includes 8 domains, one of which is cost analysis. So they're clearly really trying to drive this home from now moving forward. So cost analysis is it's sort of nested under just economic evaluation. That's a very broad term, but one of the components is definitely cost analysis. So with that, let's talk a little bit about a budget and cost analysis. So sometimes these terms might be confusing, but they're actually very different. So a budget is also known as an expenditure analysis. And what's one of the problems with a budget is it typically underestimates costs. And that's because it doesn't focus on donated time or resources for a given project or intervention or whatever it may be. Instead, it focuses on material resources, and it takes a top-down approach. So it's like, what's the dollar amount we need for this to happen? It's not so much all of the opportunity costs and like person time that goes into these things. On the other hand, cost analysis, it's the assignment of dollar amounts to required program components. So it considers both hard and soft resources. accounts for opportunity costs, and it focuses on actual costs for the implementation. So what actually occurred. So you can think of this as taking more of a bottom-up approach. Now, when we say opportunity costs, does anyone have, has anybody heard of this term before? If you want to put in the chat, if you're familiar with what opportunity costs might be getting at, let us know if that's a familiar term to you guys or not. Because opportunity cost is a really foundational concept for economic evaluation. Essentially, if somebody's going to put time into some sort of resource or training or doing some sort of intervention, there's something else that they could have done instead. So there's an opportunity cost. Is it better to employ this intervention or just do business as usual? And so that's what we're really going to focus on with cost analysis. So you might be asking yourself, so where do you start trying to determine the cost of implementing some sort of intervention or giving out some sort of assessment or measure? A really good place, especially for intervention research, is to look at the logic model or your theory of change. So each part of your theory of change is going to demand that certain activities are done. So once you think of all the different activities that are necessary across the different stages of the intervention, you can then think about what are the resources that are required for a successful implementation of each of those activities. So once you have those resources figured out, you can then think further about how many of these resources or the number of units, how many units are needed for each of those resources for successful implementation. So when we say resources, I want you to think more about ingredients. Because there's something called the ingredients method, and this is pretty much tried and true, very common. IES endorses this approach. And so essentially what you're trying to do is create a recipe to successfully implement some sort of program, intervention, or measure. So again, you're itemizing all the ingredients or resources you need for all the different intervention activities. You're going to assign costs for the ingredients and then the number of units for each of those ingredients. So when we talk about cost, there's national average costs, or there's local costs. So this is something when you're writing the proposal, it's always best to report national costs. And why do you think that might be? Because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make this information digestible and accessible to everyone. So if you're using national average costs, then if someone is in a lower than average cost of living area, then they'll look at the cost of this intervention measure, whatever it is, and say, okay, it'll probably cost us a little less than what they're reporting. Or if you're somewhere where it's well above the national average, then it's fair to say that it might cost a little bit more than what's reported. So that makes it a little more accessible and useful for possible users. So the cost is the sum of the product of the ingredients and the unit price. And typically it's good to standardize that cost into a common metric. So for example, you can create just sort of a ratio of the cost per individual served. So that's a little bit easier to digest. So there's also other meaningful ways to describe costs. You can think of it as resource categories. So there's going to be personnel costs. Those are going to be people that are doing something, whether it's training the teachers, if it's a parent taking a survey. There's materials, equipment, which is more like computers, technology, that kind of, those kinds of ingredients. Training costs, facilities, you have to have a facility of some sort to implement some sort of training. And then there's a catch-all, just other category. Another way you can think about it is cost types. So there's 3 cost types. The last one is my favorite, but fixed, essentially the addition of additional participants will not increase the cost. So that's pretty straightforward. Variable, for each additional participant served, there has to be a linear relationship for the units of that ingredient. So for example, if you're talking about a sort of like training support material, if you add one more teacher to the program or intervention, then you have to supply them with a manual. Does that kind of make sense? For every additional person added, you have to add 1 unit of that ingredient. Lumpy is a little different. It's kind of a mix of the two. And the best way to think about this is if you have a room that can hold 10 people, let's say, if you add 11th person, you would have to get another room. So yes, if you do cross that threshold, you will have to utilize another unit of this facility. Does that kind of make sense? The distinction between fixed, variable, and lumpy? So now let's talk about different types of analyses that can be done. So if you're not considering any economic data, you're just looking at effect data, you would use traditional analyses. So this could be ANOVA, regression, multi-level, whatever you're using to figure out the impact of some intervention. When you're only looking to generate cost data, that would be a cost analysis. Finally, when you combine cost and effect data in a single analysis to determine how to get the largest effect for the smallest costs, you employ cost effectiveness. So you're kind of mixing the two for that one. So that was just like a very, very quick overview. And now we'll move on to some examples. So as Allison and Sarah talked about earlier, are the different IES project types. And so this is a little table to sort of let you know what you have to do for your proposal. So if it's an exploration project, you're off the hook. No cost analysis, no cost effectiveness, you're in the clear. If you're doing a measurement product, this used to be required, but now it's actually changed to recommended, but it means you have to do the cost analysis. I would just recommend doing a cost analysis. So I'm going to give you an example of a measurement project that I worked on, that I conducted a cost analysis plan for. So for each of those types of IES projects, there's different aims, right? So for a measurement project, your aim is to assess students and to gain some sort of information on them. That's why you develop the measure. So in terms of estimating cost, we don't care about the time or resources it took to develop the item. So any kind of focus groups that you're doing to determine what items should be written or changed, that's not what we're talking about. And we're also not talking about the time or resources it takes to actually validate the measure. So here I'm talking about the actual statistical analyses that are done, the IRT scaling, whatever it is that's being done. Those don't enter into the picture of cost. What we do care about, however, is the cost to deliver that assessment. So that's the end goal here. So let's talk about a little scenario. So we have an assessment and we want to gain information on the student. We have a student self-report version of the measure. We have a teacher report, and we also have a parent report. So essentially, one research question we could have is, what is the cost to administer the assessment to 500 students from independent households, 50 classrooms, so there's 50 teachers that have 10 students each, right? So what's the cost to administer this survey across the board? Well, like I said earlier, let's talk about the different activities or resources that are required. So here, these are some ingredients that I would call our prerequisites for delivering the assessment. So first of all, if you're going to be giving an assessment, you have to have some sort of online system. This online system is going to allow users to interface with the measure. You need data storage to store all the response data. Then you need to hire or pay someone to actually perform maintenance on the system and the storage and run queries. So you need a system administrator. And then finally, there's going to be some training, because for this measure, what we're assuming is that teachers will have to help students take the survey. If they need help with the item sim, what the question is really getting at, the teacher is required to be there. So there's going to be some training involved. So first, the training materials have to be developed by the researchers. And then finally, you actually have to utilize the training materials and conduct that training, right? So the next sort of set of ingredients are around the literal administration of the assessment. So the one ingredient is the assessment itself. Next, you have to have some sort of technology to complete the assessment. So computers, mobile phones, tablets, things like that. Then you have to have a facility to administer the assessment. If it's in a classroom setting, that's what we're talking about here with facilities. And then finally, you need teacher assistants to help the students go through the survey. So there's, I'm only going to go through two of these examples. One is going to be one that is completely made up of soft resources, and this is the personnel. So there's a lot of information here to digest. It might be a little busy, so I apologize for that. But recall that we said that we needed a system administrator. And a table like this is really important for sort of summarizing the results of a cost analysis. So here our ingredients are system administrator, administering the assessment, so that's the teacher helping students, the parent response on the assessment, and then finally the teacher response on the assessment. So for the system administrator, here what we were doing was we were assuming that about 4 hours per month, this individual would perform maintenance and run queries. And so there's a total of 48 hours a year that this person would be doing stuff with the system. And so you'll notice that the prices here is $40.15. So if you look at this second asterisk, it's all about sort of finding the most appropriate cost to each ingredient. So the median hourly rate for a network and computer system administrator is $40.15 an hour. And so here's the link to exactly where I found that figure. These are very important aspects of actually conducting the cost analysis, is to get defensible prices for your ingredients. So this one's pretty straightforward. Now, if we look at the teachers, so of the teachers, we have the teacher response. So this is the teacher actually filling out the survey for 10 students, right? So what we're assuming here is that it takes the teacher 20 minutes to fill out a survey for each kid. So then that's 3 1/3 hours, 3 hours and 20 minutes. So you can see that the teacher time, the teacher costs $6,225 to actually give responses on the survey about their students. And if you look at the distribution of costs, because this is also a very important aspect of cost analysis, is, okay, here are the costs, but who's actually bearing these costs? So you'll see that the school column is coming out of there because there's opportunity costs. The teacher could have been doing something other than taking these surveys for their 10 students, right? And so here's the parent response on the assessment. So again, we're assuming that it's about 20 minutes that it would take the parent to take the survey. And so each child is being responded. Each parent is giving one response for their kid. And so that comes to just about $4,500. And you can see that the distribution of the cost is in the home column because they could have been doing something else. Again, opportunity costs. So you'll notice that there's this hourly rate of $27.20. So here I have where I got that from. This is the national average for volunteer time. You might hear other people say maybe you should use $15 because it's more of like a sort of like minimum wage. I know that's not the national minimum wage, but I've heard that used before. But it's sort of an important point to make though. Let's say you're like a Michelin chef, right? Like you make a lot of money being this great chef, but you're not using any of those skills to actually take a survey about your child, right? So a volunteer rate is actually more defensible than whatever that chef's rate would be for cooking 3-star meals, right? So one thing that I want to ask is, what do you see that's missing here? We have the parent response on the assessment. We're accounting for that. We're accounting for the teacher responses. We're not accounting for the student responses. So that's actually very much common. They say that there's no opportunity cost for students who are younger than 16 or 18 because they're supposed to be in school. That's sort of their job. So there's no opportunity cost for the students. So that's just something I wanted to point out. So moving on to hard resources, facilities. Okay, so this is my dog Chester. He's giving this look like, what are you talking about? So remember, you need a facility to be able to administer the survey to a classroom of kids. So according to Cumming Institute, a middle school special services classroom costs $60,000. So that's how much that classroom costs. But what we've done here is we've completely discounted this computer room, right? So there's 50 computer rooms, $60,000 a piece, and that comes to $3 million. So that's absurd, right? Like that's not how much it costs to administer the measure. So this is what it's all about, sort of discounting the prices. So essentially, because that room wasn't built for the purpose of administering the measure, you don't have to count this as part of the cost. Technically, if you really want to drill down to it, let's say that the room costs $60,000 and it's good for 60 years, then that means that it costs $6,000 a year to occupy that room. So that's a whole year, right? We're talking about 1 hour. So that figure gets practically down to zero and becomes negligible. So don't worry, Chester, we're not counting it.
And we actually had a question in the chat about, I think this goes back to the students and taking their time. It says, couldn't they be doing something else in school rather than taking this survey? So kind of going back to that point you made about not accounting for the student time.
Yeah, so, and Tyler, you can jump in if you want. So this is sort of arguable, like, sure, they could be doing something else, but I think just a typical approach that people take is that they don't account for opportunity costs for students. What would you say, Tyler?
Yes, IES has officially endorsed the position that you do not need to take student opportunity costs into account for the rationale Graham gave earlier. It's just, think about it. It's really hard. You would do a lot of creative writing to come up with an actual number, a dollar amount for time. And I think that's my own personal reason why IES doesn't like this too, is because it's really hard to come up with a number that's actually meaningful for how much. Like with teachers, you can come up with salaries and things like that, but with students, they have to be in school at that time. It's not like they get a part-time job or something. So I think that's why IES just says, don't worry about it.
And yes, dog pictures should be included in cost analyses as well. So yeah, moving on. So the results of the cost analysis. This is a pretty typical pattern. Personnel is almost always going to be the most expensive. And remember, personnel, most of that is made up of like person time, hours. So this is something that like an expenditure analysis or a budget is not going to fully capture, right? So that's why using a cost analysis gets you a more robust estimate of actual costs. So the grand total for this was just under $19,000 or $38 per student. So we just went over a measurement example. I'll turn it over to Tyler and he'll talk about development and innovation.
Thanks, Graham. And Graham's still driving, so you can move to the next slide. So as you probably inferred from what Graham was saying, cost analysis has a rather qualitative feel to it because you're going out and you're investigating all the resources that are being used up when you try to implement this program or this intervention. And so you're interviewing people who are implementing, you're talking to the designers of the intervention to try to come up with, tell me all the resources, including your time, including planning time, grading time, whatever it took to implement this at full capacity. What did you do to get the effects? And so at the end, after you've done all the diligent work that Graham has done, where you've generated this, this cost data, you can take the next step and combine it with your effect data. And in the first opportunity to do that in the IES structure is your development and innovation projects. And at this stage, it's just recommended, not required. The cost analysis is required, but if you want to take the extra step of combining cost and effect data, it's recommended if possible. And the reason they give that caveat, if possible, is because you can usually make the argument that we don't have a big enough sample size to do it. It's pretty easy to do that. And by the way, I should just throw in a plug. We'll talk about this later. Cost analysis, you're probably going to want to partner with somebody, have somebody on the team who at least has experience doing cost analysis or cost effectiveness analysis for IES. To establish your expertise or that there's a member of the team who has expertise, it's usually counted, have they done it, yes or no. So if you've got someone on the team who's done the cost analysis before, cost effectiveness analysis, that would be a big asset to your team. Sometimes you can write them in as a consultant. And so anyways, we've now got our, pretend we've got our cost data, we've got our effect data. You have an average effect that you've got, and you've got an average cost that you've got. The most common way that IES, that when you write IES proposals that I've seen that people propose to do a cost effectiveness analysis is to calculate what's called the incremental cost effectiveness ratio. And it's simply, what is the extra cost of doing your treatment intervention compared to whatever your comparison group is, divided by the extra effect that you expect to gain on student outcomes. And so you're hoping with this measure to give a sense for the extra cost that you have to spend to get this effect. And so like if you had an ICR of $3.1 standard deviation effects, it would be interpreted for every $3 extra you spend, you'd expect to see a 0.1 standard deviation increase. And this information will be useful to help decision makers decide whether your intervention is worth it. Because even if it has a really big effect, is all the extra money I'm spending into it justify it?
So Tyler, we have a question in the chat. It says, how do you find an expert in cost analysis when no one at your university has that expertise?
Yeah, I think we've got some resources at the very end that have a list of people who do cost analysis that you could refer to. They also have, there's a lot of resources. IES is really, you're not the only one. A lot of people doing IES grants have this issue. So IES has taken extra steps to help connect people to people who have done it. And so there are some networks that IES is building to help facilitate that. I don't know, Sarah or Allison, if you have any comments on that too, but.
Oh, I answered the question saying that a lot of times if you can collaborate with researchers who have expertise in economics or evaluation, they usually are proficient in this sort of content. So that's another way to think about it, is kind of branching out to those networks.
I think the important thing is to think about this early. Don't get stuck 4 weeks before this is due and say, oh my gosh, I don't have someone that has this expertise. Kind of go through the RFA when it comes out. And if you don't have a person in your research team that has that expertise, reach out early to people, because the first person you reach out to may not be able to take you on. So you want to make sure that you can find someone that can work with you on the project.
Agreed. Okay, Graham, if you could move on to the next slide. I'm just moving forward for sake of time. So the next I want to talk about initial efficacy and follow-up style. So these would apply to really any situation where you're going to have a big sample size. You've done some type of trial or something where you've got a big enough sample size that IES is going to require you to do some type of cost effectiveness. So before it was optional, now it's required to combine. And so what I want to show you is I should pause and for one last thought before it completely escapes my mind. But when you've got the opportunity to, if you can get data so if you see on the screen here, I've got the number of kiddos in your sample. I've broken down the costs, so just what it costs for each student, and I've also on the farthest column, I've got the effect for each student. So I've got individualized cost data broken down by student and individualized effect data broken down by student. This takes a little bit of extra effort to collect this data, but I think it's well worth it in terms of the types of analyses you can do. And that's because if you just consider the incremental cost ratio, it doesn't consider, all of that comes from the data, the average effect, the average cost, but there's one component that doesn't come from the data, which isn't being considered yet, which is how big is my budget? How much money do I have, or how much am I willing to spend to get the effect? And here people might differ on that. Somebody might say, I don't want to spend any money. Other people might spend, I've got $1,000 to spend or $20,000 to spend. And what you're willing to pay determines whether this is cost effective or not for you. So there's always, for you, is it cost effective? For you as a decision maker, is it cost effective? And so there is a way to go beyond the incremental cost effectiveness ratio to answer the question, is it cost effective for you? And Graham, if you could just jump to the next slide. This without going into the details of how it's generated, I wanted to show you this, a chart like this is called the cost effectiveness acceptability curve. It allows the reader to look at the bottom of the screen, and this lambda parameter, it represents your willingness to pay. Am I somebody who's only willing to pay $500, $1,000, $3,000 to get the extra effect? So in this case, you can say, what's the probability this will be cost effective for you to switch from what you're currently doing to the new intervention? If you're only willing to pay $500 to get the effect, this is not a cost effective option for you. But if you're willing to pay $2,500, this is almost certainly a cost effective option for you. And if say you're only willing to spend $1,000, it's like a 50-50 coin flip. I don't know whether this is cost effective for you. I'm uncertain about it. And so this type of data takes the extra component and allows you to consider what somebody willing to pay. Since you don't know what your decision maker, your audience is going to pay, by giving them a chart like this, it allows your reader to identify with whatever willingness to pay parameter represents them best in their situation. So we could have an entire class session about how to generate these things, but I wanted to kind of just give you some ideas of some of the things that are out there. And one last thing before I turn it back over to Graham is when you consider, somebody objected earlier about what if I really want to bring time, what if I really want to bring students into, like, there's no student cost. The one possibility there is, if you could, the idea of cost analysis is that you want to quantify all your resources in a common metric. And so the dollar amount is usually the most natural way to do it. But in some contexts, say like single case design research or something like that, which is really smaller, you could try to quantify everything in terms of time. How much time investment is being done? As a classroom teacher, how much time am I going to spend implementing this? You could then consider how much time students are spending doing your intervention. And that's one way to try to bring students into the mix. If you, instead of quantifying out your resources with a dollar metric, you quantify it with a time metric. So just a thought for further discussion. So Graham, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah. So one thing that I did just want to say real quick about how Tyler was saying that we have individual costs for each kid here. The example that I went through with the measurement proposal, that assumed that it was equal for all kids. So you could consider a situation where maybe they weren't using any computer rooms or anything like that, and they were doing it just individual, like at the house, and it wasn't teacher required, right? So if some kids took the survey in that manner, then it would be a little bit cheaper, right? So what you can use, there's something called a cost template. And what that allows you to do is estimate different costs for different ingredients, depending on the student and what their experience was. So that's also a huge difference between budgets and cost analysis, is you actually want to be able to figure out what actually occurred. So which students took it in a classroom setting? Was it just actually really one-on-one and the teacher spent, 3 days doing this, right? That's very different. So that's just one thing that I wanted to highlight, that you can calculate these costs on a more unique basis to capture that heterogeneity.
I would build it, especially in special education, it's like what accommodations or modifications were made and how cost, did that require extra planning time? Those kind of considerations could make it so that the cost of implementing intervention differs by student, and customize it to students. So, yep.
So that was just a real quick thing. So we've gone over some examples, and now we'll go over some writing tips now. So a really important thing is business as usual, or BAU. So depending on the type of IES project you're proposing, business as usual will look a little different. So for measurement, is there a validated assessment that already gives you information on that population? That would be a different approach. Or are there different modes for taking the assessment? Because you can understand that there would be different costs associated with a paper and pencil format, right? Because you have to print the pages. You then have to pay some research assistants time to actually store all the data, right? Score everything and put it into some sort of document. So that would cost a lot more, right? For development and innovation, you're innovating to improve some practice. So what's that practice that you're trying to improve? For efficacy and follow-up, you're trying to improve approach to produce a given effect, essentially. So you'll notice that I have a citation down here for Bowden 2020. So Brooks Bowden is a really big name in economic evaluation. And I attended a webinar that she gave last summer, right in the thick of IES grant season. And on the SRI website, you can actually get access to her slides, and her webinar is recorded. So she goes way more in depth on all this stuff. But I wanted to give credit where credit's due, because these are from Brooks Bowden. So the proposal itself, it's really important to tell a coherent story. So you want to incorporate aspects of the proposed cost analysis throughout the whole narrative. So that means it should be a research question. What is the cost to implement this measure once validated, right? So you should have information about the proposed cost analysis and the justification, why it's needed, the research plan, how you're going to do it, how are you going to make sure that you collect all the cost data that you need. And then personnel, Tyler talked about this a little bit, actually say who on your research team is going to conduct the cost analysis. You'll want to be able to say what kind of experience that individual has with economic evaluation. Have they ever done it? Have they ever written any papers, any method papers on it? And then also, if the research team doesn't have anyone too strong with economic evaluation, you can speak to what kind of resources you might leverage to help you with the cost analysis, because IES is funding things like the CAP project that's meant to help researchers actually conduct these cost analyses. And then also make sure that the research plan, budget, and timeline are consistent. Actually build out the time to conduct the cost analysis. You just want the whole proposal to essentially flow. You don't want it to be just one last paragraph at the very end of the narrative, just say like cost analysis and then put some things in there. It should really go through the whole proposal. And then also plan for sensitivity analysis. See how much the cost estimate changes when you make different assumptions or design it differently. So those are some writing tips. And for resources, these are probably the main ones. This SHRI.org, it's at the bottom of the page, but the slides that Brooks Bowden presented on and the recorded Zoom are there. And that's a really good resource. She also goes through each of the different types. A caveat though is it was from last year's RFA, and the RFA for this year isn't out yet. So we don't know how much that's going to change, but at least it's a good starting project. This cost analysis and practice project, they're there to help you with these types of questions. And finally, there's something called Cost Out. This is also a IES funded product. So what this website allows you to do is first, it allows you to create a profile, and it actually contains a database of cost information. So I think the information I got about the teacher salaries, you can find like the size of, how much a certain room costs. So that's where you can get a lot of really good cost data. So I encourage you all to check these links out. And I think that does it. Are there any questions that you have for myself or Tyler?
Thanks so much, both of you, for sharing this wealth of knowledge with us. And yeah, feel free to put questions in the chat as we're wrapping it up. But yeah, those different resources are really important. If you've never done this before, I think that looking at some of if you go back one slide, Graham, the database and then the CAP project website, there's templates on those websites. So it allows you to kind of plug and play and kind of figure some things out. It's really helpful. So those are, again, as Graham mentioned, those are sort of endorsed by IES right now. So I think it's helpful to use the tools that they're investing in your own proposals. Okay, I'm not seeing any specific questions in the chat at the moment. So
I was just going to say that if after this presentation or some other time, if a question does occur, you feel free to reach out to us after the presentation. I'm sure Graham would agree that we're happy to just do an email or something like that.
Graham and Tyler, I have a question. So if I were to reach out to, let's say I don't have someone who can do this. And so maybe Tyler, I reach out to you and I say, hey, Tyler, would you like to help me with cost analysis in my grant? Like, how have you had those conversations with PIs before? And like, does the PI suggest a rate? Do you suggest a rate that you would charge? Like, how do those conversations go?
Yeah, really good question. A lot of times what happens to me is I'll get a contact from somebody looking for a cost consultant. And it's usually built in just the way that any other standard consultant would be. So it's like the standard consultant fee. And what they'll do is they'll say, would you be interested? Here's my project, a small pitch. And then I'll respond, yeah, I'm interested in your project. I'd like to learn more about it. So then what usually happens is I ask to see sort of, could you share what you've written so far with your cost analysis section? Because I'd like to look it over and maybe have some improvements of my own I'd like to add to it. And so after that, I will usually, give them, my feedback, assuming they accept it and like it, then, I'll give them my CV and my letter of support that they can include in their application.
And when you're budgeting, do you budget a lot of time at the beginning of the project and the
Yes.
end, or do you budget time throughout the years of the project?
Usually the most time is devoted to the beginning and end, for the reason that the beginning, setting up the plans, is really critical and important, especially a lot of the cost data. It's really like qualitative research, where you really have to have a well thought out plan of kind of interviewing you're going to do. So you're collecting the data. But once that system is set up, the infrastructure to collect the data, then you really don't need a cost analysis too much for the middle of the project. But then again, at the end, when you're actually doing the analysis and disseminating, then again, you want the help of a consultant. So that's usually how it is. You're exactly right.
All right, that's really helpful, Tyler, especially as you plan budgets and figure out how much of your expenditures can be put toward the cost analysis.